Earthshock was the first story to feature the Cybermen since Revenge of the Cybermen 7 years earlier. I don't think I knew much about them at the time. It wasn't until the 20th anniversary and the Radio Times special that I really got to know about the history of the show. But this is just the first in a long line of stories that brings back enemies from the show's past. And it goes all the way up to the Awakening, so it's something we'll just have to get used to. The first episode is very different to the others. It centres around a platoon of soldiers investigating the disappearance of several geologists. It's not entirely clear what branch of the armed forces they're from. Unusually for the time, the soldiers are an equal mix of male and female, which is a good thing in theory. But in practice, all the female soldiers look a bit small. You'd think they would have some sort of minimum height requirement. The soldiers are attacked by androids, who are seemingly unstoppable, and are still quite sinister, with their blank faces and their complete silence throughout. And the cave sets are pretty good as well. Meanwhile, in the TARDIS, Adric throws a massive tantrum and announces he wants to go back to E-Space, even though his brother is dead and everybody else there hated him. There might be a possible meta aspect, where he complains about always being treated as a joke, although it could just seem that way in retrospect. Anyway, the Doctor storms off, incredibly angry at Adric, which is perhaps the most relatable the character has ever been. Once the Doctor meets up with the soldiers, he quickly takes charge and helps them to overcome the androids. And then there is another tense sequence where he defuses the Cybermen's bomb. Both these scenes are familiar from any number of action movies, but it's not the sort of thing you normally see in Doctor Who, so it feels fresh and exciting. After this, the Doctor and Adric make up, and Adric reveals that he never wanted to go back to E-Space after all. I can understand why they did this, but it would have been more dramatically satisfying if they'd still been fighting at the end. The second half of the story takes place on an unnamed freighter in deep space. Of the 3 crew members, 2 are played by older women, which is again quite forward-thinking for its time. The captain is played by Beryl Reid, one of those people who was always on television when I was a kid, but I can never quite figure out what she was famous for in the first place. She normally played drunken old women, so is perhaps not the first choice to play a hardened space captain, but to her credit, she gives it a good go. She latches onto the character being concerned with profit above all else, and so manages to be reasonably convincing. But it's always funny when she addresses her subordinate as Mr. The final 2 episodes are full of action, with Cybermen and soldiers blasting each other to oblivion. And it works really well. The sets are excellent and the direction is fast and furious, cutting between shots at a rate you never usually see in Doctor Who, and the military-style music matches it perfectly. The Doctor is still paired with Adric throughout, which makes sense given the ending, but it does mean that Nyssa is stuck in the TARDIS once again. At least Tegan gets to have a go at being a soldier. She looks a bit silly with a big gun, but she does manage to kill a Cyberman, albeit one who is already wounded. The Cyber leader is played by David Banks. Despite being encumbered by his massive helmet, he brings a lot of personality to the role. His delivery of lines such as "excellent" and "more power" are iconic. It's true that he shows more emotion than Cybermen are really supposed to, but you could argue that he's just been a hypocrite, like most dictators. The scene where the Doctor confronts him is rightly celebrated, as the Doctor asks, "When did you last have the pleasure of smelling a flower, watching a sunset, or eating a well-prepared meal?" To be honest, I can't really remember the last time I did any of those things, but it's still a great scene. Finally, we have to address the death of Adric. Spoilers, by the way. It's a beautifully constructed sequence. Everything in that final episode is geared towards getting him there, on the bridge, on his own, at the end. It's established that his mathematical skills are the only thing that could possibly defuse the bomb and save Earth, so his decision to stay behind is a heroic moment and goes a long way to redeem the character. I remember being shocked as a child, at the time being a small boy in the world of adults, so I could really identify with him, much as I would later identify with Wesley Crusher in Star Trek The Next Generation. So it was definitely a big moment for me, and the silent credits just hammered home the importance of it. Even in the new series, they've never killed off any companions, at least not without giving them a happy ending afterwards. Maybe it's time they did. The Doctor, meanwhile, deals with his grief over Adric's death by brutally killing the Cyber Leader. First by using Adric's badge, and then by shooting him several times with his gun, which feels very wrong, and you can only justify it by saying that his desperation to Adric has perhaps driven him to it, as it's not something the Doctor would do in normal circumstances. Nyssa also gets to shoot a Cyberman, so that means all 3 of the remaining cast are now killers. No doubt they will all deal with their collective guilt in the next episode, or perhaps it will never be mentioned again. The DVD has about 50 minutes of extras. There's a 32-minute documentary putting the shock into Earthshock, which is very comprehensive. It has contributions from around a dozen people, including Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat, before they even wrote for the series. And we learn that Moffat hates Adric as much as he hates killing off companions. There's 8 minutes of film sequences, but it's mostly more scenes of soldiers shouting into their radios, and a 10-minute clip from Did You See, which is really just an excuse to show lots of clips of Doctor Who monsters over the years. And there's an Easter egg with a stop-motion episode 5, in which Adric survives the crash only to be eaten by a dinosaur. It's very short, but probably took several years to make, and I'm not really sure it was worth the effort. Overall, an excellent story, full of action, and an unforgettable ending. I'll give it 9 out of 10. Next week, Time Flight. This season really goes from one extreme to the other. Press subscribe to see what I make of that, and I'll see you next time.